Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Housing crisis, affordability is an issue that has been foremost in the last municipal campaign in Toronto and the last provincial campaign in Ontario, seemingly across the country. And I'm joined today by Mike Moffat. He's a PhD. He's a housing innovation, trade, and regulatory expert. I saw him quoted in a couple of articles recently. He's published numerous different studies. Welcome to the show, Mike.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So do we have a housing affordability crisis in Ontario right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had one for some time now that rents have been going up across the country, particularly in southern Ontario, for new leases in many cities in Ontario. If you want to get a one-bedroom apartment, rents are up over 20% year over year. And home prices are getting quite expensive as well and have been for some time. For a while, that was at least somewhat affordable because of lower interest rates. But now that combination of high prices and high interest rates, we're feeling the pinch on both the ownership and the rental side.
What's the cause?
Biggest cause is population growth, or at least not building housing to keep up with population growth. There's certainly other things going on. We've had fluctuating interest rates. We can look at short-term rentals and that kind of thing. But every person, every family needs a place to call home. And when our population across the country is, growing by over 1 million people a year, and we're only building about 200,000 homes a year, that math simply doesn't work, particularly when a lot of those homes are one-bedroom condos. You can't fit five people in a one-bedroom condo, but that's essentially what we're having to do, again, because population is growing quickly, but our housing starts and completions aren't keeping pace.
So the federal government obviously is interested in immigration and has got this very optimistic and sizable immigration policy. And so they don't seem to think that population growth is the problem. They think population growth is the solution, obviously, for some issues in regards to demographics and labor pool and stuff like that. The provincial government seems to think that it's supply or lack of supply or constraints on supply that are the issue. What do you think of that?
Well, it's basically they're the same problem, right? That basically the population is growing and housing starts aren't. And you can look at it from two sides of the coin, right? You can go, okay, we need more housing, or we need to do something on the population growth side. But we should note that most of our population growth recently, it actually doesn't come from immigration. So immigration is a sort of form of permanent residency that, you could either have been in Canada a while, or you've moved to Canada and you become a permanent resident. Where our population is growing is, in fact, temporary residents. It's a lot of international students and temporary foreign workers, and groups like that are here for on some kind of time expired visa. Now they may become permanent residents at some point. But basically what's happening is that our pool of renters is going up and up and up. We're seeing, college enrollments here in Ontario go up substantially, but colleges aren't building residences. So what happens is all of those college students need somewhere to live. So they start renting places, causing rents to go up. Well, investors look at that. They start buying up homes, turning them into student rentals and so on. So, what happens on the rental market bleeds into the ownership market. So overall, it's two sides of the same coin, that the population is growing faster than housing, and you can address that either way. My own view is that we should address that through more housing, but I think we do need to start looking at things like college enrollments and going, okay, is what we're doing on the college side, does it really make that much sense?
But Mike, you're actually a Dr. Moffat. You're an economics professor. Mm-hmm. You and I both took economics course at Western University, mm-hmm. and you went a lot farther in economics than I did. But basically, it's supply demand, and I thought, based on what I learned at Western in economics, is if you've got this massive increase in demand, someone is going to provide the supply, and seemingly no one is providing the supply. How can you have 1 million people added to population every year and only 200,000 housing starts? What's causing this dramatic undersupply of supply?
Well, simply put, like we don't really have anything that looks like sort of a free market in housing. That Ontario's housing market combines the worst aspects of Soviet-style central planning, where we sort of have the government say what can go here and there, with the worst parts of free market capitalism, where you have sort of landowners able to charge high prices and get land rents. That basically we've got a broken housing system where it's difficult to build more housing. First of all, due to things like regulations and zoning, right? I can't, for instance, I can't just build, like I couldn't tear down my house here in Ottawa and put in a small apartment building if I wanted to, even if I had the space. That just goes against a variety of regulations. So we have the regulatory side to look at. We have the tax side to look at. We tax new construction the same way we tax cigarettes and alcohol, through a variety of different things. So even if there's demand for housing, can you earn a decent rate of return after you've paid the development charges, the GST, all the fees, and so on? So, we have these issues there. We have labor market bottlenecks as well. Do we have enough electricians and roofers and plumbers to build those homes fast enough? And I think we also have to look at the productivity of the sector. My dad was a sheet metal worker, put heating and cooling and did duct work in apartment buildings back in the 1960s and 1970s. We build housing the same way we did back then, despite the fact we don't build anything else the same way. So, it's this combination of, sort of red tape and taxes and shortages of labor, and an industry that hasn't really seen much productivity growth in the last 50 years.
Soviet-style regulatory framework? Seriously?
Well, I'm not saying the whole thing is. I'm saying we've kind of combined the worst elements of both, right? That we have planning, and you do need to plan communities at a certain level. Like, absolutely, you don't want people putting a steel mill next to a daycare, right? You have to have a certain level of planning, absolutely. But just the amount, how prescriptive our planning system is in Ontario and in Canada, relative to a system like Japan, where you have a lot more flexibility, a lot more elasticity in the system. So, you have that. And again, coupled with again, all the sort of challenges in a free market system. So we've taken kind of the worst elements of both. And I'm actually surprised the system, to be honest, as design works as well as it does, right? That it's this weird mishmash of rules and regulations and ways of doing things that just kind of evolved over time. And it's far from ideal. And I think it's gotten us to the place we are now, where we can't ramp up housing construction to keep up with changes in population growth.
So what are we going to do?
Well, I think there are things that we can do. So, and I would look at all the sort of levels of government. On the federal side, there's a number of things we could do. So the provincial government has asked the federal government to remove the GST and HST on purpose-built rental apartment buildings. So these are taxes that developers and builders need to pay up front, despite the fact that they can't charge GST to renters. So that makes these projects somewhat capital constrained. So that's one thing we can do. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, that the federal government had very favorable tax treatments for building apartment buildings. They started to ramp those down in about 1972, ironically enough, because we were building too many apartments back in the 60s and 70s. We need to look at bringing those back. On the provincial side, there's a lot we can do. On the regulatory side, I think there's a lot we can do to increase the number of skilled trade workers. Those are all bottlenecks. And on the municipal side, we have a lot that we can do on zoning and approvals and parking minimums and a variety of different regulatory levers. So no one level of government's going to solve this. I think we all need to work together to develop a system that has a little bit more flexibility to it.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Mike Moffat. He's an expert on housing. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes We're going to talk a little bit more about this housing affordability crisis, what governments can do, what interest rates play in this equation, and whether we're going to be able to solve it. Because one of the issues is if you solve it, probably prices have to come down, and is that something that really people want? A lot of people have their net worth built up in homes, and if prices come down, that's a big hit on a lot of people. Stay with us, everyone. Interesting conversation tonight. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our topic tonight is housing affordability, and is it in crisis or not? My guest is Mike Moffat, Dr. Mike Moffat, PhD. He's a housing innovation, trade, and regulatory expert. He's currently an assistant professor in the Business Economics and Public Policy program at the Ivey Business School at Western University. He's also the senior director of policy at the University of Ottawa's Smart Prosperity Institute, running the policy shop arm of the organization. Mike, what the heck is the policy shop of the Smart Prosperity Institute?
Yeah, so the Smart Prosperity Institute is an organization at the University of Ottawa that looks at any issue at the intersection of the environment and the economy. So we do a couple different things. That we have an academic research network where we fund hundreds of academics, mostly in Canada, but some around the world, on these issues. And then we have our what we call the policy shop that does a lot of applied policy work on a variety of economic topics. So we do a lot of labor market research. We do a lot of work in the agricultural space, and I lead the whole policy shop. But I also lead the housing end of our research, as it's a particular interest of mine.
And then you have got something called the Place Center, which is a spin-off organization, I understand, focused on place-based economic policy. What the heck is that?
Yeah, so a lot of these issues, like housing, for instance, are very different depending on where you're looking at from. That the issues in Windsor, Ontario, are different than the issues in Windsor, Nova Scotia. You know, that Toronto and Truro have different issues. So what we've done is taken, historically we've looked at big sort of national issues and look at what the federal government can do. At the Place Center, we work with local communities to bring people together and go, okay, what would a made in Mississauga solution to the housing crisis look like? So it's very sort of hyper local, where we work with local partners, workforce development boards, chambers of commerce, those kinds of things, to craft local solutions, because we realize that one size fits all solutions tend not to work very well.
I understand you did something similar to that, sounds like that, in Hamilton and Burlington recently. It's got to have a lot of similar applicability to Mississauga. What were your suggestions in Hamilton and Burlington? It was titled something like A Place for the Hammer.
Yeah, who will swing the hammer?
Who will swing the hammer?
Who will swing the hammer? Yeah, and it was just basically looking at the intersection between housing and labor supply, and what we're starting to see in Hamilton, and I suspect we would see something similar in Mississauga, is that Hamilton's actually doing pretty well at attracting young workers. That you graduate from McMaster or U of T or Conestoga College or wherever. Hamilton's a great place to be if you're in your 20s. That the apartments are still relatively affordable compared to a Toronto, and at the income levels that you can earn in a Hamilton, you can make a go of it. But what they're starting to see is challenges when people are starting to raise families and having kids. That a lot of those young couples with young children are moving out to like a place like Thorold or Brantford or Woodstock or so on. And in theory, that shouldn't harm the commuting, or that shouldn't harm the labor market, because you could always live in Brantford and work in Hamilton. But what we're starting to see is that if you're a young nurse and you decide to move to Brantford, you're probably going to work in Hamilton for a bit, and then you're going to realize, hey, wait a second, Brantford needs nurses too. So we're more looking at the challenges and what we're seeing on the labor market side, rather than necessarily provide solutions in this report. But it's just that the understanding that Hamilton needs more housing suitable for young families, because they're starting to lose the nurses and the teachers and the carpenters, hence the name, because of this housing thing. So when we look at the housing crisis, we can't just think it's an affordability crisis. It's also a labor market crisis because we're starting to price out the young middle class.
So in your report, I understand you said that housing needed to be doubled in Hamilton. In Mississauga, if we're to reach the goal set out by the provincial government for 120,000 starts a year, we've got to have like a 5 or 6-fold increase in housing starts. Is a doubling possible in Hamilton, and is a 5 or 6-fold increase possible in Mississauga? And is this 1.5 million incremental homes that the CMHC is calling for, or the 1.5 million homes just absolute that the provincial government is calling for in the next 10 years at all possible?
It's going to be incredibly challenging, and I'm particularly worried about it because we've lost some time. We're already 19 months into this 10 years, and basically housing starts are only up a couple of percent. So that is absolutely going to be a challenge, and we're losing time. So I think we need to aim towards that goal. I think if you look at population growth, that goal is necessary, and in fact, may not even be enough. But it's going to be a real challenge, and particularly, and you're right when you look at Mississauga, that they have the most aggressive housing target of any, or were given the most aggressive housing target of any of the 29 communities. That on average, communities were asked to double their housing construction. And you're right, for Mississauga, it's more like a four-fold increase. So there's going to have to be some massive changes in order to hit that. And that would be one community. Of the 29, I think Mississauga is going to be the most challenged, partly because the target is so aggressive, and partly that, unlike, say, a London or Ottawa, there's a lot less greenfield space in Mississauga. It's a little bit harder to build out somewhat.
Why would Mississauga be given this higher target? Do you know?
Because it's basically because Peel region is growing so quickly. A lot of it, again, comes back to international students that. I think you've got about a half dozen colleges across Ontario that have built satellite campuses in the Mississauga area. So the target for the Peel region in general tends to be really aggressive. That said, I don't know the exact methodology that the province came out when they released these numbers. So I don't know where they are on this. I wish they were more sort of transparent. So part of it I can kind of look at again, okay, where's population growth coming from? A lot of it's coming from the higher ed sector, and a lot of that is centered around Mississauga. But how they got to 120 versus 100,000, I wish I could tell you, but I really don't know.
So my understanding of it is that they actually took a look at where housing starts were and population increase versus the absolute level of population. And Mississauga had one of the smallest percentage increases, and the province determined that was a problem, and that they had to get up to provincial averages, if not above, if we were going to meet the housing targets. And I guess the implication of that, particularly given what your comment is about lack of green space to not green space, but of land that you can start with, is that you got to have increased density, and that the province criticized Mississauga that Mississauga had not allowed a lot of height and a lot of increased density. Mississauga historically has been known as a suburb of single family homes. Do you think that it is the province's right to be demanding that places around the GTA increase their density and height?
Well, I think we're going to have to do something. I don't love the approach that they're taking, that's the sort of top-down approach. I wish this had been more of a negotiated plan where the province had said, okay, we've got the numbers here. We know we're going to need 1.5 million homes. Where should we build them? Recognizing that's a little bit zero sum, saying, okay, if we're going to build few in Mississauga, that means we need to build more in Kitchener-Waterloo or wherever. But I can tell you, I have this conversation in every single city, And I've yet to find a city that says, okay, we need more. Every city says, well, we're pulling too much of our weight, and some other city should build these. So, I don't love the approach that they're taking, but I do think we need to do something, right? That we've completely sort of priced out the young middle class of most of the GTA, and despite the fact that that's where the jobs are. And I don't think it's great for the standard of living or for the environment to basically tell young families, like, no, sorry, you have to drive out to Woodstock before you can find a home, and then you can drive back in every day to your job at Pearson Airport. Like, I don't think that's a great way to run a province either.
I interviewed another smart guy with something called the Growth Lab at Harvard, and he was with the Kennedy School, which I guess is not as economically oriented as you are, but reasonably policy oriented. And he said the problem was our common law structure that allowed a lot of opposition and NIMBYism to exist, and that places that have been able to somehow corral NIMBYism back ended up being far more supportive of housing and didn't have the housing affordability crisis that we have. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I do think there's something to that, and I think our consultation process is broken on all sides. That, for instance, it does take a lot of time to get built, but I can also understand people who have issues or have challenges with it, feeling upset about the current system as well, right? Because you have an official municipal plan that says, okay, this can be built here, there, and wherever. Builder or developer gets an idea for a new project, which goes above and beyond that. Local residents will say, like, hey, like, we've got a plan, and this is against the plan, so, like, what are you doing? You have this consultation, and then the building goes up anyway. I can understand why people are frustrated by that, right? That why nobody likes this system, right? Because residents feel like they're not being heard. Developers and builders are saying, like, hey, you keep telling us you want housing, but every time we try and build some, you sort of block it. So I think we need to find these more sort of collaborative systems. And I think part of it is trying to find ways to develop a plan at a higher level, so you're not constantly doing everything on these oppositional one-off issues. But absolutely, there are models we can look at in Europe, in Asia, that work a little bit better than the system that we've developed in kind of what I call Anglo-American countries. So United States, Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia, all kind of work about the same. There are also the 5 countries in the world that have the biggest housing crises, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
So one of the suggestions he made is that things like zoning, et cetera, should be done by either a provincial entity, a state entity, or the national entity, and that when you allowed it to be done by municipalities, the people making the decisions were too close to existing voters, and therefore were overly influenced by existing landowners that were oppositional to things. But if you allowed things to be decisions on zoning and density and things like that to be made by either the province or a comparable state or the national, they did things in interest of everybody. And that was a better system. And he used Japan as an example that implements such a system. Any point of view on that?
Yeah, I've heard that before, and I think there is some merit to it. That if he's right, that if you look at look at just from an outcomes point of view, that Japan and other countries that have these systems tend to have much more functional housing market. I don't know if I would love to go quite that far. I think there is value to having local decision making. I think we just need to find kind of a hybrid approach, or some kind of way to say, okay, that the province can set these sort of municipal standards, or set sort of minimum standards, but communities can work within those standards to do things that are appropriate for them. Because I don't necessarily think what's good for Mississauga is necessarily what's good for London or Woodstock or Ottawa. So I do think there are rules for areas where you can have these minimum standards. You can have the provincial or national standard, but I do think there is a role for local decision making, and I'd hate to see that completely go away.
We're chatting with Dr. Mike Moffat today. He's an expert on regulatory affairs, has commented a lot about housing. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with Mike in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Mike Moffat, Dr. Mike Moffat. He is a professor at the Ivey Business School at Western. He's also in Ottawa at the University of Ottawa Smart Prosperity Institute. He's a housing innovation, trade, and regulatory expert. We've been talking about the housing affordability crisis in Ontario and Canada, in the GTA right now tonight. Mike, I wonder if I could ask you about the last municipal mayoralty campaign in Toronto. And it was interesting because people on the right seem to be arguing, consistent with what the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, was arguing, that supply was the issue and that we needed to deal with regulatory barriers and increase supply. And people on the left and the winner, Olivia Chow, seem to be arguing the problem was more social housing and rental housing. Which is the issue?
I'd say both. We need more supply, period. We need more market supply and we need more social housing. But in general, like if we look at Ontario, about 3 to 4% of our housing stock is social housing of some form. So that the remaining 96% is market based. So, I certainly think we need to double our amount of social housing, but that's still only going to bring us up from 3 to 4% to maybe 7%, right? So that only takes you so far. So I think it's both, and I think often it's a false dichotomy that a lot of the things that prevent social housing from being built are the same thing that prevent market housing from being built, and those are regulatory barriers, GST, HST, taxes and development charges and things like that. So. I think if we have a housing system that works well, I think we'll naturally have more market housing and more social housing. But I do believe there is a role for social housing, that there is a segment of this market that you're never going to be able to build cheaply enough to make it affordable for people. So there is absolutely a role, and then a role to have things like supportive housing, where you have it's not just housing but other services lumped in with it.
Some people think that we're going to have the Manhattanization of Toronto, that anyone below a certain income level won't be able to afford to live. Is that a problem?
Yeah, I'd go further than that. I think my fear is that Toronto's turning into San Francisco. That just you start to see, not just the high prices, but the sheer amount of homelessness and people living on the streets and everything kind of in between. So. That is a real fear that I have. I think we're moving in that direction, and I think we need to address this housing crisis because it's only getting worse. And I think we can look at some of those cities, again, particularly San Francisco in the United States, and go, okay, that's the path we're on, and that's not a place that we really want to be in this country.
Mike, you're a professor at the Ivey School of Business. I've got 2 kids that graduated from Ivey. One with HBA, one with an MBA. They both got good jobs in Toronto. Neither of them can afford a place to live. They've got good jobs. They graduated from a top university that you teach at, and they can't afford a place in Toronto.
Yeah, and this is actually part of why I got into the housing issue. What kind of gets me up in the morning, that I've taught HBA at Ivey. So this is an undergrad program, and I teach HBA 2, which is 4th year undergraduates. Done so for the last 16 years. So I basically, spent the last 16 years hanging out with 22-year-olds. And I can tell you the mood of the HBA students has changed dramatically over the last few years. That most, like in a political sense, that 10 years ago, my students were this kind of very happy, centrist, Obama-ish, yes we can, Leslie Knope kind of girl power thing, to now they want to burn down the system. They're just like, we're never, we're at a top school in the country. We're all going to get good jobs. And despite that, we're never going to be able to afford a home where the jobs are. So that is a massive issue when you've got, Ivy students can't find jobs, let alone everyone, or can't find housing, let alone everyone else. It's a massive issue. Young people are upset about it, and they have every right to be. That we've essentially failed them as as politicians, as policymakers, and so on.
So a year and a half ago, the provincial government had a housing affordability task force that came out with 57 recommendations on what to do with housing. About 7 of them were implemented in a bill that was passed by the Ontario legislature. But there's been Bill 23, Bill 109, or something like this, and they've done a lot of things to try to make it more difficult to oppose developments and make it easier and faster to get developments approved. There's a rumor that they're coming out with something in regards to making it easier around major transit stations and not have height restrictions. But yet developers are still saying it's very difficult. So are any of these things having any positive impact?
I think they are a little bit at the margins, but I actually think the way the provincial government's going about it is actually slowing down development. That let's take the transit example as a really good one. That, for instance, in New Zealand, you can build up to 6 stories within 1 kilometer of a subway stop or LRT stop. The province could do something like that. Well, right now, if you hold a piece of land next to a subway stop or LRT stop, you're not going to develop on it, right? Like, why would you develop on it now if a year from now the rules are going to be more favorable to you? So the fact that this kind of drip, drip, drip in policy is creating so much policy uncertainty, and you're seeing a lot of developers go, well, interest rates are bad right now. There's kind of a labor shortage. And, why don't I just wait a couple of years until there's a better set of rules? So I really think that, the province's incremental approach, I think, may be harming development just because everybody's kind of playing this wait and see game right now.
You talked about interest rates. Are interest rates impacting it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely right. On the ownership side in particular, that you're getting hit kind of a couple ways. The first of all, for developers and builders, they have to pay those higher interest rates, right? There's just a cost of capital for them that's rising. So that's raising costs on the supply side, and on the demand side, this really cooled off demand because first-time home buyers don't want to go into this market. People who might have invested in pre-construction development, they're kind of going off the market and so on. So, the supply side's getting hit, the demand side's getting hit. And what's happening is a lot of those people who had been first-time home buyers, they're staying in the rental market longer. So what it's doing is that kind of friction in the ownership market is kind of bleeding over to the rental market. And it's one of the reasons, again, why rents are up 20 to 25% on new leases in many parts of Southern Ontario.
You mentioned HST on new construction. One of the criticisms that the provincial government has had is development fees. Development fees in Toronto last year went up by something like 47%. The quote that keeps on being used is the development fees in Burlington are 1/5 of what they are in Mississauga. And so therefore they clearly don't have anything to do with actually the cost of new development of infrastructure. And some people think that it is a tax on new home building, on young people, on newcomers, et cetera. And then the counter to that is, well, no, we got to put in new fire stations, new infrastructure, new parks, new schools, et cetera. And so therefore development fees are critical. And why should existing taxpayers pay for things for new construction? It should be the new people that pay for that. Where do you come out on development fees, sir?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where both have a point that we do need to pay for these things. So, and that money has to come from somewhere, whether it's development charges or property tax or what have you. That money has to come from somewhere. I think the challenge is, are development charges simply paying for new infrastructure for new residents? Like if I use an example, if I build one of those 6-story subway or 6-story mid-rises by a subway stop, I'm going to pay millions and millions of development charges. Is that money actually going to, the sewer and the water and things like that building needs, or is it building a lot of infrastructure, parks, schools, things, not schools, sorry, like parks, fire stations, things like that, that will be used more sort of community wide, libraries and so on. So a lot of that development charge money actually does go to benefit existing residents. So I do think we need to find a better way of doing things that, if we look like in Ontario's history, for most of Ontario's history, we didn't have development charges. We've done things different ways. And other provinces do things differently. Like in Montreal and most of Quebec, development charges are largely non-existent, or they just structure things different. It's a lot it's a lot less. So I do think we need to be looking at these things and seeing if there's a better way of paying infrastructure for infrastructure. But we do need to recognize that we do need a lot of infrastructure, and it does need to be paid for somehow. And new residents are probably disproportionately going to use that. So it does make sense that they should pay fair bit of the bill.
So you think that new residents should be paying a fair amount of the development charges. The provincial government has limited development charges or eliminated them. The local municipalities are saying you got to give us the money from somewhere else. You think that the provincial government is being too heavy-handed in some of this regulatory stuff. But the provincial government, if anything, is last year I think there were something like 47 or 57 ministerial zoning orders where they were really heavy-handed. Interest rates are, you say, part of the problem, and I just spoke with someone an hour ago that said they're going to stay high. They're going to be sticky, Brian. Don't think they're coming down anytime soon. The federal government is still interested in immigration, and if anything, is more supportive of immigration and student visas and things like that you've said are an issue. You know what, Mike? You haven't been very helpful here.
Well, I think I would like to frame it more that I'm showing the extent of the challenge here. That we need to build more housing, but we have all of these headwinds kind of pushing against us. Because I agree on interest rates; it doesn't look like they're going down anytime soon. So again, how do we fix this? I think we need to have a more sort of collaborative approach where we have all three orders of government get together and say, okay, this is what we're trying to accomplish. How can we work together on this? And you do need a collaborative approach because these policy instruments work together. Like if I talk to the federal government and I say, hey, I think you should remove the GST, HST on apartment buildings, they might come back to me and say, well, look, we don't think that's going to get any more apartment buildings built because there's just not the zoning for it. Or I could go to the municipalities and say, hey, you got to zone more for apartment buildings. And they go, well, we do that. But then we just hear from the developers that, it's just taxes make it unviable. But if you can make both of those changes at the same time, you might actually be able to get something. So, I do think you do have levels of government that can sometimes be a little bit heavy-handed. I do think we need to look at reforming development charges, not necessarily eliminating them, but trying to figure out how we can better align infrastructure needs with costs so we're not, just taxing the heck out of new housing. Get together and work on this. But it is a big, hairy problem. And I think we should be skeptical of anybody you hear go, okay, like there's, I have this silver bullet solution. And if we just did this like one thing, it would fix everything. Unfortunately, the hole we've dug ourselves into is far too large to allow that to happen.
So a few weeks ago, coming to Mississauga as an example, there's a Lakeview generating station, former Lakeview power generating station, 140 acres. And the provincial government came in with a ministerial zoning order and doubled the density that the city and the local community and the developers had agreed upon and negotiated. And there was a big couple-page article about it in the Toronto Star last weekend. And then in addition, up and down here, Ontario, where the new LRT is being built, they increased density for a lot of buildings close to the transit stations. And effectively what they were saying was that the city of Mississauga had been overly conservative in a lot of the density approvals, obviously. And it was a top-down doubling of the density. Is that good or is that bad?
I think the outcome of having more density is good. I think the process is bad, right? I don't think the solution should just be the province kind of bigfooting municipalities. That I think what should happen again is this kind of give and take, this negotiation where the province sits down with municipalities and again says, We need 1.5 million homes built in the next 10 years. What are the things that we're going to do to get us there? And have a negotiation, have a conversation. I think just, having the province come in and just tell municipalities, just kind of stomping all over their municipal plans, I don't think is a valuable approach. So I don't like the approach. I do think we need more density, but I would want to see that density come through collaboration and negotiation rather than this kind of top-down approach of saying, no, this is something that needs to happen. Because residents are going to get upset about it, but also you go, okay, well, if you're not there on the ground, how confident are you that you have the wastewater capacity or the stormwater capacity or all of these other issues? If we're just kind of saying by fiat, no, this building here, has to go from 6 stories to 18 stories without any kind of study or anything like that.
We're chatting tonight with Mike Moffat about the housing affordability crisis in the Greater Toronto Area, Southern Ontario, Canada, effectively today. We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dr. Mike Moffat. He's a professor at the Richard Ivey School of Business. He's also at the University of Ottawa. He runs something called, is it called the Smart Prosperity Institute?
Smart Prosperity Institute, correct.
Sounds like an impressive organization. Mike, this has been a very discouraging chat tonight. Lots of problems, and it sounds like every single one of the solutions that different levels of government have recommended that I've talked about, you seem to have some negative comments about. So let's say, if you were the Minister of Housing, if you were the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, or even better, if you were the Premier of Ontario, what would you do, buddy?
That is a great question. So the first thing I would want to do is collaborate with the other 2 levels of government, sort of recognizing that shouldn't go around stomping on everyone. But I think out of this this challenge comes opportunity. So, for instance, we're seeing some great new technologies come out on the housing side. So mass timber being one, where you have these kind of, again, 6-story buildings that can be assembled through these mass timber, which is basically just this kind of compressed wood, and it has some really nice properties to it. It's has nice climate properties. It has some nice affordability properties if we can start building it at scale, and it actually requires a lot less labor to build. If we can, use innovation policy, procurement policy to start building more mass timber homes, we can create a whole industry here in Canada that we can export around the world, because we're not the only ones having this housing crisis. So I actually think we should use the challenges that we're having as an opportunity for economic development to get new technologies, 3D printed homes, mass timber, and buildings offsite, that kind of thing. I think we should treat this as an innovation challenge, and I think we could start to come up with some creative solutions to this. So, although, yeah, I've been kind of doom and gloom on all this, I kind of see how big a problem it is. I get frustrated at governments that seem to be a little bit more focused on pointing the finger at each other rather than finding solutions. But I think there are solutions here. And I think if we can work together, we can not only solve the housing crisis, but I think we can create a whole lot of jobs and opportunity at the same time.
Mike, I was touring a condominium project that was under construction last week, and I saw this one person down on her knees, and she was putting in probably about 15 different pipes into different pipes in what would be eventually the kitchen. And it was unbelievable the amount of stuff that she was having to connect up on suite after suite after suite after floor after floor. And then I saw someone else up on a ladder, doing the same thing with wiring. And then I saw this guy that was on stilts that was putting some plaster up on a ceiling, and then cement that was being taken up to the top by a crane. And they said that the height was too high to pump up, and so therefore they were doing a very inefficient process with the concrete. And I asked the supervisor, the superintendent, what was going on. He said, Brian, there's less productivity in housing less modernization in housing than in almost any other industry. What do you think of that?
That's absolutely true. And I think it's one of the biggest issues we have in this sector is just that we haven't changed the way that we've done things in the last 50 to 60 years. I think we should look at that. I think the more that we can turn housing from a construction industry to a manufacturing industry, do prefab panels off-site where you've got your wall panels, the wiring's already built in, so you're not having to go, okay, I got to get the drywall guy and then the electrician and so on. Because if we do it as manufacturing, we can start building these things 24/7, right? We don't have to just build when the sun is shining, right? We can we can create all of these panels, all of this offsite work done by robots, truck it in, and then have the humans assemble it to, from 9 to 5. So I think that's absolutely correct. And I think, if we're going to double the amount of homes, we're not going to be able to double the amount of electricians and sheet metal workers and so on. We're going to be lucky to just hold pace given how quickly they're retiring. So I think that's absolutely correct. And I think we need to figure out how to turn housing from a construction industry to a manufacturing industry.
You described a couple of minutes ago how the 22-year-olds you teach are pessimistic about the future. What do you say to them?
Well, I say to them, again, just kind of what I said to you, that there's opportunity in the challenge, that I think we should look at, use it as a business opportunity, right? That people need more homes. We haven't figured out how to crack that. So I say the first thing is, again, there's a business opportunity there. And I think the second thing is I'm always trying to encourage them to go into public policy, that a lot of our greatest minds are kind of going elsewhere. So I'm always encouraging people to go into the think tank world, maybe work in government for a few years. But I say, yeah, you know what? You are absolutely right. This is a crisis, and we're going to need young people with the intelligence and the drive to change this. So, and I'm hopeful that some of them will, but I think they're absolutely right to feel as frustrated as they do.
Dr. Mike Moffat, thanks very much for joining us and talking a little bit about our housing affordability crisis, about a lot of the problems that we've got, but also ending up with some optimism about how we can solve it, and about how some of your 22-year-olds have got to get involved in this industry to have the positive impact on it. Really appreciate your time, sir.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's our show for tonight. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa or London, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.